So I'm happy to welcome to a conversation with the Rochester Beacon, Meredith Dragon. Meredith, for the past 7+ years, has been the the CEO of the Jewish Federation of Greater Rochester. And we're going to be talking about Israel, understanding it better, which is certainly important, understanding the context in the given the things that are certainly going on right now, both in Israel itself and also how it's affecting Jews in the United States. And actually, I want to start off, Meredith. I know you just got back a few hours ago from a trip to Israel. Can you tell us about the trip and what were your impressions of what you saw on the ground in Israel?
Yes, I did just get back. And Alex, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. It's an honor to be here. I did just get back, and it's interesting. The mood on the ground is both really one of sadness, still some shock, and at the same time, tremendous hope. So the trip was a 36-hour solidarity trip with leadership from the United States to be with our friends and colleagues and family in Israel. We spent time meeting with those most impacted by the war. So we spent time with those who live in the Gaza envelope, the region that was attacked. We met with families who have lost loved ones. We met with families who have lost loved ones and have loved ones who are taken hostage. And there's a lot of sadness, anger, upset. We also spent time looking at civil society programs. And I think one of the most astounding things that we really got to see was the resilience of the Israelis, and not just the Jewish community, all Israelis, Arabs, Bedouins, Jews, who have really come together and created opportunity to volunteer and to support those who've been most deeply impacted, and those who have friends, loved ones, family members who are serving in the military right now. 350,000 reservists have been called up. So pretty much everybody's impacted. And these programs are extraordinary. People are donating their time, their resources to help others. 250,000 Israelis have been moved in the country, those from the area impacted, as well as from the north. Seeing people open their homes and just take care of each other gave me such hope for what the future will look like.
Well, and one of the things that I wanted to make sure we got into today is kind of speaks to or builds on a talk that you gave about a week ago at the Jewish Community Center of Greater Rochester, where I'm on the board. And particularly, you focused on some of the background information, really going back to ancient times and kind of through more recent history. And I think it's very important because even many Jews aren't necessarily certainly familiar. It is complex. It is even for those of us who are Jews, it's something that's thousands of miles away. Life is busy, and it's not always kind of clear to everybody the truth sometimes of claims or grievances that people have.
Yeah.
But yet it's so important to understand some of those details. And in particular, I'd love to start off with some of the history. One of the things that's I think seems compelling to people is this idea that the Jews are colonizers, basically, of this land of Israel. Can you talk a little bit about kind of the history of Jews in Israel?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the biggest misconceptions, and I think it's a very dangerous narrative because in today's world, being the colonizer, the oppressor, is obviously it's not only a buzzword, but it's held up to to show a history of abuse, racism, oppression. But the truth is that the Jewish people have been a part of the land of Israel for nearly 5,000 years. When you go back in time, the the history, the archaeology, the teachings in our the Old Testament even have the Jews in the land of Israel. And it's a culture, it's a religion, it's a people that have existed on this land for many, many, many thousands of years. it's really quite impossible that we can be white European colonialists colonizing Israel, mostly because the vast majority of Israelis are not white Europeans. And I think that when you look at more recent history, even in 1948, with the founding of the state, and many people don't know this, but there were nearly 1 million Jews living in Arab countries at that time because when we were kicked out of Israel during many of the times that we were kicked out, the first temple, the second temple, Jews went to the area they lived most closely to, which were Arab countries. With the founding of the state, Jews were expelled from those Arab countries or killed. So you saw an influx of 1 million Yemenite Jews, Moroccan Jews, Syrian Jews, Tunisian Jews who populated the country. They were indigenous to the area because Jews are indigenous to the area. So when you talk about Jews being white colonial oppressors, it's technically not even possible because we have been on this land since 2,000 years before the time of Christ, long before the founding of Islam, and even in recent history, we arrived in the land because we were expelled from the countries that we live in. And the irony is that when you talk about colonial oppression, England had control of Israel from the early 1900s until 1948, until the UN partition plan. So there was colonial oppression in the land, but it was from Great Britain because that's who colonized most countries. So, putting that contextually on the Jewish people being colonizers is really an anti-Semitic trope because it's making us associated with what's bad in society, which is generally how anti-Semitism happens. Whatever is bad is the fault of the Jewish people. Being colonizers is bad, therefore Jews are colonizers. And it helps to inflame anti-Semitism because it can't be anything further from the truth. This is the homeland of the Jewish people. It always has been since Judaism began.
Well, one of the other things that one hears quite often is that perhaps the very founding of Israel was um, people in Europe feeling guilty and therefore kind of handing over
Yeah.
this piece of land, and that they didn't kind of care initially kind of what happened to the Arabs that were also
Mhm.
obviously living kind of among and next to Jews. Can you talk maybe a little bit about
Yeah.
that history? Kind of what is it that led up to the UN decision and the partition
Yeah.
plan that they initially put
Yeah.
together?
Well, it's interesting because I do think the world believes that Israel was created as a reparation for the Holocaust. You've suffered, so we're going to give you this piece of land without any sort of connection to it. Except that with the modern Zionist movement that began in the late 1800s, Jews had already been returning for decades prior to 1948. There had been a resurgence of a desire for Jews to live in the land of Israel. And mostly because of rising anti-Semitism around the globe, which has always been a challenge for the Jewish people. So the natural creation of the state of Israel didn't come. Israel wasn't born out of the Holocaust. It was born out of history, and it was born out of the Zionist movement, which was about creating a Jewish homeland or recreating a Jewish homeland because Jews had a homeland both during the first temple period, the second temple period, and going back to our roots. So with the end of World War II and the dividing up, with the end of World War I and the dividing up of land, parts of the Middle East ended up in the control of England, part ended up in control of France. But there was recognition given long before 1948 that Israel was a Jewish homeland with the Balfour Declaration in 1918. The intent always was to recreate a Jewish homeland there. So in 1947, with the UN partition plan, the plan was let's create a Jewish state and let's create another Arab state, whether it's Palestinian or otherwise, so that whoever lives in the region can both have a homeland. And with that, in 1948, when Israel declared its independence, with the approval of the United Nations, legally, Israel ended up being attacked by 5 countries because the Arab world at the time didn't want there to be a Jewish state in the middle of the Arab world. So, fortunately, we survived that. The lines of what was a Palestinian state and what would have been then, had it not been rejected, a Palestinian state, actually has far more territory in Palestinian control than in Jewish control. And it was really based on population density. So there are funny borders. Where there was a majority of Jews, it was a Jewish state. Where there were a majority of Arabs, it was an Arab state. And back then, back in 1947, we could have had peace. We could have avoided all the wars had the Arab world said, great, we agree, Jewish state, Arab state, but that wasn't the case. So after the Independence War, the borders looked very different, and Israel became a modern, much more contiguous state than the original UN partition plan.
What do you think was really the motivating factor for the two-state solution that was offered in 1948 to be turned down? And maybe specifically, one of the things that people talk about now is that Israel has developed this amazing military. But this was nowhere close to what was the case back in 1948, and was part of the reason that it was turned down potentially because Israel didn't seem, or kind of the Jews that were then in the newly declared Israel didn't necessarily seem like much of a foe, and war seemed to be a preferred path.
There was a promise made to many Arabs who lived in the areas that were predominantly Jewish to leave those areas to go to either the West Bank or Gaza to seek refuge there until the countries that invaded the newly formed state of Israel took back control and kicked out the Jews, and they'd be able to go back home again. And that's why we still see Palestinian refugees today. They were created as refugees because of the war in 1948, the Independence War, and the promise that was given to them by the Arab world. That promise has obviously never been fulfilled, and it's created multi-generational refugees, which is something that this issue was created by the United Nations. There's never been another circumstance where we have in the world multi-generational refugees, which is part of the reason why there isn't peace right now, is because of the issue with refugees. I think the Arab world thought that it was not possible that Israel would be able to fight back and win the War of Independence. I still think it's quite miraculous that Israel did. And why did the Arab world not want Israel there? I think because the Arab world, not everybody today, because there is peace with some countries today, but at the time, the entire Arab world galvanized around this notion that they didn't want a Jewish state in the middle of the Middle East. Israel is sort of right in the hub, in the heart of the Middle East. And it was, if you look at the state of Israel, it was claimed to be like a sword in the heart of the Middle East. And there was this notion that there was no recognition at the time, and still today from some countries, that Jews had any right or any claim to that land. It was viewed as all Arab land, and therefore they were going to fight to keep the Jews out of it and off of it, and to claim all of the land in the Middle East. And many still do. I mean, other than the four countries with whom we have peace now. So even after the War of 1948, I think it's really important that people know the war ended, but there with armistice lines, but not with peace treaties. So technically, Israel was at war with all of those countries other than Egypt and Jordan, which they reached peace with, decades later. There were only ever armistice lines. There was never any recognition still, and from some of those countries still, that Israel could exist as a Jewish state in the Middle East.
I mean, one of the things that struck me when I first visited Israel many years ago, so my grandparents, when we were all leaving the former Soviet Union, my parents and I ended up in the United States. My grandparents moved to Israel and lived out their days in Jerusalem. And I remember visiting them for the first time, and it was almost a little bit confusing because when I looked at people, it was very hard oftentimes to really tell the difference. I mean, you mentioned that there was, up to about 1 million or so refugees, Israel or Jews, that were kicked out of surrounding lands around the Middle East and northern Africa that all kind of came together. And oftentimes, especially walking around Jerusalem, but really everywhere in the country, it was very hard to oftentimes for me to tell the difference between, fellow Jews and the 20% or so, which were Israeli Arabs. I mean, in some ways, it's, and maybe speak to that as well, because it seems like a lot of people don't sort of appreciate that there's a lot of diversity of all sorts within Israel already, and Arabs obviously already live there. Can you talk a little bit about kind of what the history of that has been?
Yeah, it's a great question, because I think it goes back to your first question, Alex, about Jews being colonizers and being white and European. But the truth is, the vast majority of Israelis are much darker than you or me, or certainly me. Um, because so much of our roots are in the Middle East, we are more brown and dark skinned than light skinned. So, and many Jews also speak Hebrew and Arabic, which, there's a lot of similarities between those languages as well. There's a lot of commonality. I mean, even before the state of Israel was created, when people emigrated to the area, particularly under the British Mandate, like my mother-in-law came from Greece, and she's dark. She's Greek. She came from Greece in 1936. When you look at her identity card, it says that she moved to Palestine and she's Palestinian. I mean, that's what her card. So there is so much melding of culture. The Jews from Yemen, from Morocco, they look like they're Yemenite, and the Jews from Morocco look like they're Moroccan. Not to mention the hundreds of thousands of Ethiopian Jews who we've rescued and brought to Israel. So there's a large Black community, there's a large brown community, and I would actually say, white is probably a minority in Israel and not the majority. But when you look at American Jewry and people base Israel on American Jewry, because most, but not all, but a good chunk of American Jews came from Eastern Europe, like you, like my family, and we look Eastern European, it's the sense that we all look Eastern European. It's really not the case. Israel is probably as great, if not a bigger melting pot even than the United States, because of all of the people and all of the cultures and all of the countries who've ended up there, including Jews from India, from Asia. The population is so diverse, in many ways more diverse than the American Jewish population. Israel is one of the most diverse countries in the world. And like you said, more than 20%, actually 25% of the Israeli population is Arab. 5% of them are Christian Arabs, 20% are Muslim. So, even just within that, in the religious diversity, you have Druze who are Israeli, and Bedouin, and Christians, and Muslims. It's really, and it's hard to tell. To your point, you can't necessarily tell the difference unless somebody's in their traditional religious garb for some reason. And the military is made up of all those components as well. So, when you look at the face of the Israeli military, it's an incredibly diverse face, because you have Arabs, Bedouins, you have Druze who participate in the military, and Jews, and there are Muslims who participate, and the Bedouins are Muslim. So, this notion that it's a homogenous community couldn't be any further from the truth. There's so much diversity in Israel. And to your point about being in Jerusalem, all you have to do is pretty much walk down any street in Israel, and you get a sense of the kind of diversity that exists there. You also see it in the Knesset too, in the government and all institutions. If I can add one thing too, this is why it also makes me crazy when people call Israel an apartheid state, because everybody who is a citizen of Israel has the exact same rights, regardless of your skin color, regardless of your religion or no religion. Israel is truly a democracy. Arab parties, Jewish parties, whomever has representation in government and fully participates in every aspect of society. An apartheid state doesn't do that.
Can you talk a little bit about some of the more recent history, really post 1948? And
Yeah.
part of the reason I'm asking is some of the things that are oftentimes talked about sort of indicate or appear to try to rationalize this idea that peace wasn't offered or peace wasn't possible, and therefore there was some justification to do whatever the leaders of Gaza had to do. Can you talk a little bit about kind of
sure.
The history of what's happened since 1948?
Yeah. Yes. And there are a lot of dates, and it gets very confusing for people. But I think one of the most important things to know is really the dates particular to peace and the conversation around occupation. Because today, one of the things I hear all the time is about 75 years of occupation. The 75 years, when people talk about occupation, they are talking about Israel proper. They're not talking about the West Bank, and they're not talking about Gaza, because the West Bank was part of Jordan at the time the state was founded, and Gaza was part of Egypt. So when you go back to 1975, what you're saying is that the modern state of Israel today was illegally occupied by Jews. It's also saying that the Jews should not be in that land as occupiers. And when you talk about calling for genocide, where are 7 million Jews supposed to go if you're saying that Israel shouldn't exist as a Jewish state? So that 75-year mark is really important. And wars, 1948, 1953, 56, 73, there wasn't peace. 67 obviously being one of the pivotal moments, which was the Six-Day War, where much of the issues that we're talking about today really began was with the Six-Day War in 1967. Israel was attacked by Syria, Jordan, Egypt, and ended up defending herself in that war. And with that, ended up taking the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt in the Six-Day War. So the Sinai Peninsula and Gaza became a part of Israel in 1967. The West Bank from Jordan became a part of Israel in 1967. And in the north, the Golan Heights, which strategically made Israel a much bigger country and a much safer country because of where the other countries were in their borders. When you talk about peace, and fast forward from 67 to 1978, is the first time Israel has reached a peace treaty with any country, and that was with Egypt in the Camp David Accords. At the time, it was an important moment because the idea of land for peace came to be because Israel gave back the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt in exchange for peace. And there has been an honored peace treaty with Egypt ever since. It's not necessarily a loving peace, but it's a lasting peace. And that's really all that matters. But the interesting thing about that peace treaty is that at the time, Israel said, well, Egypt, if you're taking Sinai, you should take Gaza back. That was yours. And Egypt said, oh, no, we had that land for a long time. It was really problematic. That's going to be your problem. Thank you very much for not taking Gaza back. So Israel kept Gaza after the Camp David Accords. And fast forward, you look at the Oslo Accords in 1993 and 1995, there was a moment in time where I think we really believed that we would, again, have a two-state solution and there'd be a land for peace swap. And unfortunately, we got very far along in that process. So much so that, you remember the signing with the potential signing with Bill Clinton and Shimon Peres and Yasser Arafat. They were at the table to sign the agreement, and Yasser Arafat walked away in 2000. And that, I think, was the moment that the world shifted, because Yasser Arafat gave up the opportunity really to have a lasting peace and a two-state solution. And all that's really happened. And there have been a number of times since the year 2000 when Israel has offered peace and offered 99% of the concessions that the Palestinians had wanted. Every single time, the Palestinians have walked away from the table because it wasn't 100%. So, and I don't know in any peace negotiation, or any negotiation for that matter, where anybody ever ends up with 100% of what they walk in wanting. So, the situation that we're in right now, multiple times between the Oslo Accords in 93, the peace plan with Bill Clinton in 2000, and then a number of times between 2000 and even up to 2020, even under President Trump, there were peace negotiations that were walked away from. So, we're in this situation now where peace has been offered, an olive branch has been handed from Israel to the Palestinian people to create a two-state solution and to live in peace. And it's always been rejected. And not only has it been rejected, it's been responded to with either terror or war. So, so going back to Gaza, even the last 7 of 8 wars in Israel have all been wars that have come out of attacks from Gaza to Israel. And during that time, there have been multiple offerings of peace, and they've all been rejected and met with generally missiles and terror.
And I think that's perhaps also part of the complexity that people don't necessarily appreciate or know about. That, I mean, there's the West Bank, there's Gaza Strip. In the
Yeah.
West Bank, you have the Palestinian Authority. You mentioned Yasser Arafat. That was really kind
Yeah.
of the emissary or kind of the leader
Mhm.
of the
The
potential
PLO.
to, or yeah, the
Yeah.
PLO, and
Yeah.
really he was the one that was negotiating to potentially get a two-state solution. But Gaza and Hamas, can you talk a little bit about the history there?
Yes.
Because I think that
Yeah.
those details, the fact that this attack is Hamas and it's from Gaza, seems to be very relevant to the prospect of peace or lack
It,
thereof here.
it for sure, and it's so important that people understand the difference between the West Bank and Gaza and how it's operated, because the West Bank, to your point, is operated under Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority, and there are significant parts of the West Bank where it's all under Palestinian Authority control. Israel has no operation within, it's called Area A, in the West Bank. And um, until 2005, the Palestinian Authority also operated in Gaza. So, two different areas. However, the Palestinian Authority government oversaw the West Bank and oversaw Gaza. So why 2005 is so important is because in 2005, Israel completely withdrew Gaza. Not only did they withdraw from Gaza, they physically relocated every single Jewish person that was living in Gaza. They removed them, sometimes forcibly, and they relocated them to Israel. So Israel pulled out in 2005 and said, we're giving Gaza back to the Palestinian Authority. It's 100% under your control. We have no control of Gaza anymore. You run, operate, provide all the services, and we're gone. So even when people talk about the occupation, Gaza hasn't been occupied. It was under Palestinian Authority control. With the growth of Hamas, there was actually what I'd say sort of a mini civil war between the Palestinian Authority and Hamas in 2006. And in 2007, there were elections held in Gaza, and the Palestinian people who lived in Gaza at the time actually voted Hamas into power and kicked out, also forcibly, and killed many of the Palestinian Authority. So the Palestinian Authority has had no authority over Gaza, nor has Israel since 2005. Well, Palestinian Authority 2005 to 2007, but since 2007, the Palestinian Authority hasn't had any control. Since 2005, Israel hasn't had any control. And it was under the control of Hamas solely. So, the responsibility for the last 18 years of Gaza has been Hamas. And Israel has had no troops, no people, no bodies living or controlling the area. And Israel's worked hand in hand with Egypt for safety and security issues because Egypt has safety and security concerns about Gaza as well. So people talk about the blockade. Well, the blockade is a joint blockade between Israel and Egypt because of the growth of terrorism out of the region. At the same time, billions and billions and billions of dollars has gone into Gaza to Hamas to help rebuild the area, to build schools, to build hospitals, to build roads and infrastructure, to build water systems, to build electrical plants. And that money that we see has been invested either in the pockets of the leaders of Hamas, many of whom don't actually live in Gaza, they live in Qatar and other places, and in this incredible tunnel infrastructure that exists under Gaza that's been used for terror and missiles. So, part of the issue around water, there's part of what people have been screaming about, Israel's cutting off the water. Well, when you think about it, Israel really necessarily shouldn't have had responsibility for water in Gaza, but they did. In part, 50% of the water coming into Gaza was from Israel. The other 50% was supposed to be supplied by Hamas. However, what they've done is they've taken all of the piping for water and they've used it for missile launchers. So all those cement tubes have actually been repurposed. So part of the reason they don't have water is because the Israeli system was shut down temporarily, and Hamas never built a water system. So, I don't know of any other country where you would expect the neighboring country to supply your water and electricity. And even today, one of the leaders of Hamas came out and said, "We're not responsible for the civilians live in Gaza. We're responsible for Hamas, for the terrorists." They call themselves terrorists in their own words. it's the UN, Israel, and Egypt's responsibility to take care of the civilians. So, what Hamas has done is they've created this incredible terror network with the billions of dollars that has come into Gaza. And then the news and the media has made this Israel's responsibility with this totally inaccurate statement that Israel occupies Gaza. Israel hasn't occupied Gaza for 18 years. It's been 18 years, and billions of dollars have been invested in terror instead of people and infrastructure.
I mean, one of the things that people, I think, rightly point out or are concerned with is the plight of those who've been living in Gaza and have been living, and to a lesser extent, but certainly also in the West Bank during all of these years. And
Yep.
sometimes they may even look at some of the disagreements, of which there are many, kind of, ideologically, politically, among Israelis, among Jews, as maybe even like evidence that things could have been done better in the
Yeah.
past. Can you
Yep.
talk a little bit about both of those? I mean, one kind of some of the ideological approaches or arguments that within Israel and within the American Jews as
Yeah.
well have had kind of with one another, and what is the feeling of many Israelis or Jews toward those who are growing up and have been living in very difficult conditions?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a few pieces to this. One is, you know, I think people inaccurately say right now that this war is about Israel and the Palestinian conflict. This isn't about Israel and the Palestinian conflict. This is about Israel and Hamas. Because I really believe the vast majority, not everybody, but the vast majority of Israelis believe that the Palestinians deserve to live in peace, like the Israelis do, and they deserve to live in a place that's free, um, and that they deserve to live um, in a democratic state like Israel. So part of the challenge that you have is Israel is a democracy. It's a true democracy, just like our country. And it's a democracy that's negotiating with the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, which isn't a democracy. Mahmoud Abbas, who's the leader of the Palestinian Authority, was voted into power in elections that were supposed to re-happen, I think, 15, 16, 17 years ago. So, it's a dictatorship. And it, the Palestinians who live there live under difficult circumstances. There's no way to say it. And I think the vast majority of Israelis recognize that, and they would like that not to be the case, because when you oppress people, they want to rebel. The blame gets placed on Israel, but they're oppressed as much by their own governments as they are by any other forces. In Gaza in particular, the people who live in Gaza live under terrible oppression by Hamas. And I think there's nothing more that Israelis would want than for those innocent civilians who live in Gaza or in the West Bank to be able to live in peace and freedom, and democracy, and to enjoy all of the things that Israelis do living in a democracy. And at the same time, Israel is still a country. And just like our country, countries make mistakes, and they don't necessarily always do what I think the people would want them to do in the moment. The vast majority of Israelis would really be very happy to live in peace, not to have any more war. I think there are Israelis who don't like that there are communities, settlements, if you want to call them settlements, in the West Bank, and they wish that Israel had never done that. It does make achieving peace more complicated, although all of those borders and land for peace and swaps, actually were agreed to in negotiations. But look, like with every society, you have those who are on the very far left and those who are on the very far right. If you take away the extremes and their beliefs, the vast majority of Israelis want to live in peace with the Palestinians and have two states and let people live. But you can only make peace with those people who want to have peace. And unfortunately, there haven't been good partners for peace. So even though that may be the intent of everybody, and I think probably the vast majority of Palestinians feel that way too, but they don't have the control to make a difference because they don't control their government. And it makes the situation tense and very complicated. And, I think Israelis would like nothing more than having their kids at home and going to university and not going and serving in the military. Um, there was somebody who said to me recently, they posed a question, and I thought it was really quite interesting. They said to me, Meredith, what what would happen today if all of the countries, all of Israel's neighbors put down their weapons? And the answer is there'd be peace. The reverse of that is what would happen today if Israel put down its weapons? And the answer is, I think there'd be no more Israel. So, you know, and all of those complications are recognized. They're recognized by the government, by the people. And even with that, I believe that Israelis would like to be able to put down their weapons and live in peace. And I think that is true of everybody in all spectrums. It's just a matter of what it looks like, and how much land and who controls the land. Um, but, look, when, in 1967, when Israel gained control of the West Bank, it never annexed the West Bank. It always was territory. And I don't know, you could go back to 1967 and say maybe the West Bank should have been incorporated. Maybe Gaza should have been incorporated. But I think it's really hard to look at Israel through the lens of our American eyes, because Israel is still a burgeoning country, 75 years old. Even in 1967, the country was only nearly, 20 years old. So the decisions that you make when you're 20 versus when you make when you're 70, 75 are very different. And certainly there are many things Israel has done wrong along the way with the issues in the West Bank and in Gaza. At the same time, I don't think any of it justifies terror. And I don't think there can ever, in any part of the world, be justification for any sort of acts of terror that are taken out against civilians, because civilians are not necessarily their government. They're certainly not with Hamas. And even those who are living in the region that was attacked most recently by Hamas, many of those communities lived there because they actually believed that they could make a difference. And by being there, they could actually help achieve peace between those in Gaza and those in Israel. And I've heard so many stories, especially when I was just there, about people who were killed who did things like work on the Gaza border and took children to hospitals for illnesses, who brought food and all kinds of things to the border. People who employed Gazans in particular because they wanted to create a higher socioeconomic status in Gaza. So, part of the upset, what's going on right now, is a real betrayal that people feel like they developed relationships between Palestinians in Gaza and they were betrayed by them, in addition to being attacked by Hamas.
So before our time runs out, I do want to
Yep.
switch to the United States, though.
Yeah.
One of the things that's also struck me, and I'm sure it has you as well, is all the people that have reached out to me, Jews around Rochester, around the United States, that are saying kind of one or both things, that they'd never really kind of maybe fully appreciated how much anti-Semitism there either is, or how much it's grown, or how much it's acceptable to show it publicly. Obviously, we just had last night the arrest of a Pittsburgh native who was a Cornell student that had kind of issued some quite horrific threats to fellow Cornell students. And then secondly, just beyond kind of anti-Semitism in the abstract, people who are feeling more fearful than they ever have, sensing that they need to kind of hide kind of who they are as Jews, that there's some danger afoot that they really don't recall in at least in recent decades. I mean, what's your kind of what are some of your thoughts and observations on how this moment is affecting Jews here in the United States?
Thank you. I think people are in shock. I think they're in shock from the terror attacks. And I think Jews still suffer from generational trauma. We have been the victims of Inquisition, pogroms, the Holocaust. You came out of Soviet Jewry, Alex. The oppression of Soviet Jews. Over 1 million that finally either got to go to Israel or the United States. This has been our collective history, and I think Jews in America, for the most part, have felt like there's been no other country on earth that has ever allowed us to grow and flourish and practice and be Jews so comfortably. I mean, this really is the American Jewish community is the most vibrant Jewish community, obviously, other than Israel, that has ever existed, ever in our history. So what's happened, this backlash, when people say that I'm only anti-Zionist, I'm not anti-Semitic, that just doesn't carry any weight, because what's happening is with the anti-Zionism, the attacks are on Jews who are not necessarily Israeli, maybe have nothing to do with Israel. But when the world um, is angry with Israel and violently angry with Israel, it's the American Jewish community, the European Jewish community, the South American Jewish community that gets attacked. So if it isn't about anti-Semitism, I'm not sure what it's about then. And, in the last 2 weeks, exponentially over 500% increase in anti-Semitism in this country. And I think it's something that American Jews never thought they'd see in their lifetime. It's pervasive in our schools, on college campuses, as you mentioned, Cornell, but not just Cornell, Harvard, UPenn, Columbia, University of Michigan, here in Rochester, at the University of Rochester, even. Using tropes that people say, well, that's not anti-Semitism, except it is anti-Semitism. And I think people feel scared, because what our history has shown is that when people rise up against and protest, whether it's Israel or the Jews, it ends in violence. And we've seen growing violence with the Jewish people, the Jewish community. If anything, it's sort of galvanized us together, which I'm not sure this is the reason why we want to galvanize, but I think it's revealed that there is this deep-seated anti-Semitism in this country. And whether you're talking about it because of anti-Zionism, anti-Zionism begins and ends with the same traditional tropes that anti-Semitism started with, which is about Jews being too much of what the bad thing is. In Nazi Germany, we were too dark. Here we're too light. We're colonialists. We have power. We have control. We have money. Those are the same things that, by the way, aren't necessarily true. But it comes back and we get blamed. And then, and then there's violence. And I think for our parents in particular, they're really worried about their kids, and violence. And with this Cornell student, we saw it was these threats that this young man made were violent threats. And that's what this movement has created. It's created this notion that there is collective blame and collective punishment of the Jewish people for whatever Israel is or isn't doing. I always say that we know something is anti-Semitism if it dehumanizes Jews, delegitimizes Israel's right to exist, or creates a double standard between how you would treat Jews and another minority. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing the dehumanization of Jews, the delegitimization of Israel, and double standards applied. I mean, when you see all over this country where people are hanging up their signs of people who've held hostage, and those signs are getting ripped down, dehumanizing children, babies who are held hostage, that is pure outright anti-Semitism. And I think for many, fortunately, they've never had to experience that in their lifetime. But I think it's caused the American Jewish community perhaps to begin, or have been beginning, to rethink what and how we identify as American Jews and what that means. I think some, particularly college students, to your point earlier, are really scared to be identified as Jews. Many young men who would normally wear a kippah are wearing baseball caps instead because they're afraid to be identified. Kids have taken mezuzahs, on the doors, down in dorms. They've stopped wearing Jewish stars or chais. People are trying to hide their identity, which makes me really sad, because I think the most important thing for us to be as Jews is to be proud of who we are, proud of our heritage, proud of Israel, proud of what we've accomplished as a teeny tiny minority in this world. I think it's also caused us to understand that we really have to stick together, and understand that anti-Semitism can't be stronger than us as a people, and that we need to persevere.
I mean, you mentioned campuses and universities, and I think what particularly surprises some people, it certainly was eye-opening for me also, that when I look at some of the polls that are done, and they break them down by age groups in terms of, who sort of who thinks that this was even an act of terrorism as opposed to justified.
Yeah.
And there's questions they're asked, like, do you think this is a false story, that this didn't happen or is
Right.
being exaggerated? And you see that older people, they almost are entirely kind of, see things in the same way that I think, as most Israelis see it. And then you
Yeah.
have a pretty large percentage of kind of this 18 to 24, an 18 to 35 category, depending on kind of how they ask it, in some cases, I mean, 25, 30%, 50% are basically kind of standing with Gaza or even standing with Hamas. I mean,
Hamas.
depending
Hamas.
on how the
Well,
question is asked.
this
That part I think is concerning for the future.
well, this notion that this is justified resistance, that this is justified resistance for occupation. Again, there is no occupation of Gaza and justified resistance. How can it be possible that it's ever justified to go into civilian homes, to rape women, shoot down young people, to decapitate babies, to kill women and take babies from their womb, to shoot elderly Holocaust survivors? I, I don't think that is ever justified, period. And to say that's justified or it's not as bad, the claims are exaggerated. That's anti-Semitism. I don't think in any place in the world, any country would tolerate what happened in Israel. And when you look at the numbers, it's as if you want to make a per capita comparison, it's as if terrorists came in and 50,000 people were killed in one day, brutally, brutally, brutally killed. Mowed down at a music festival, decapitated, murdered. There can never be justification for that in this society. And the other thing I want to say too, what we see on college campuses is this chanting from the river to the sea. Palestine will be free. I think most young people don't even understand what that means. They don't know that it's the Jordan River or the Mediterranean Sea and that the land in between is Israel. I think there's such a lack of knowledge and understanding of what people are doing or saying, and there's a real lack of history. And look, young people like a good cause, and this seems to be a cause that's easy to grab onto without having the historical facts, and it ends up being about feeling and emotion, and those feelings and emotion end up being stronger than what the facts are on the ground. And I think our kids get sucked into it, which is why you see those numbers. They just don't understand.
Just as a final quick question for those,
Yep.
especially kind of in the Rochester Jewish community, maybe Jews who are still trying to process and understand this,
Yep.
maybe non-Jews are trying to understand it. Are there kind of resources or advice you have about how people should try to learn more or heal?
I think being together in community is really important. With the Federation, the Jewish community, we're putting together a lot of programs, educational programs, opportunities to gather, participate, to wear, our blue ribbons to show solidarity with the hostages. I think the more that we can be present with each other and participate is one of the best things that we can do to continue to show up at our synagogues, at the JCC, at Federation programs, and not to give up hope. I mean, I think being together, being in community, and being hopeful are the most important things that we can do together. If someone has had an incident where they feel like there's anti-Semitism, certainly reach out to the Federation. We have resources to help both in school and community, and we're really here to be of assistance to people in any way. And then to keep front and center that there are 240 people still held hostage in a terrorist state. We can't forget those hostages, and we have to work together to make sure they're freed peacefully and alive.
Thank you. Thank you, Meredith Dragon, for
Thanks,
joining
Alex.
me today. It's, I think, been very insightful, and hopefully more people hear some of the message and the information that you provided here today.
Alex, thank you, and thank you for the opportunity. I really, really appreciate it.